The following excerpts are from the book The Tavistock Institute by Daniel Estelin, and the passage I'm about to read covers some of the information regarding the starting points for Project MKultra. This is called Liberation Through Drug Abuse. Earlier, in 1952, a proposal was issued to the Directors of Central Intelligence outlining the funding mechanisms for highly sensitive CIA research and development projects that would study the use of biological and chemical materials such as LSD in altering human behavior. On April 13, 1953, MKultra was established for the express purpose of researching and developing chemical, biological, and radiological materials to be used in clandestine operations and capable of controlling or modifying human behavior. Quoting Jeffrey Steinberg, as these monstrous notions of mass social engineering were being presented as the quote-unquote humanistic alternative to world war in the age of the atomic and hydrogen bomb, crucial projects were being launched that would shape the implementation of this brave new world and bring us today. It is noteworthy that one of the four directors of the Authoritarian Personality Project, R. Nevitt Sanford, played a pivotal role in the 1950s and 60s experimentation and eventual mass usage of psychedelic drugs. The Authoritarian Personality Project of the late 1940s was responsible for engineering the baby boomer drug rocks sex counterculture of the 1960s. In 1965, Sanford wrote the foreword to Utopias, the Use and Users of LSD-25, which was published by Tavistock Publications, the publishing arm of Great Britain's preeminent psychological warfare agency, the Tavistock Institute. Tavistock directed the psychiatric division of the British Army during World War II and dispatched many of its top brainwashers to the United States in the immediate post-war period to work on the secret mind control projects of the CIA and the Pentagon, including the MKultra project, devoted to the study of LSD and other psychedelics. In his foreword to Utopias, Sanford, who ended up at the Stanford University Institute for the Study of Human Problems, a major outpost for MKultra secret LSD experimentation. Sanford wrote, the nation seems to be fascinated by our 40,000 or so drug addicts who are seen as alarmingly wayward people who must be curbed at all costs by expensive police activity. Only an uneasy Puritanism could support the practice of focusing on the drug addicts rather than our 5 million alcoholics and treating them as a police problem instead of a medical one, while suppressing harmless drugs such as marijuana and peyote along with dangerous ones. Lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, was developed in 1943 by Albert Hofmann, a chemist at Sandoz AD, a Swiss pharmaceutical house owned by S.G. Warburg. LSD's principal component is ergotamine tartarate, which Hofmann turned into synthetic ergotamine, a powerful mind-altering and highly addictive drug. Looking deeper into the LSD history, we discovered that while precise documentation is unavailable as to the auspices under which the LSD research was commissioned, it can be safely assumed that the British intelligence and its subsidiary U.S. Office of Strategic Services were directly involved. Alan Dulles, the director of the CIA when that agency began MKultra, was the OSS station chief in Bern, Switzerland, throughout the early Sandoz research. One of his OSS assistants was James Warburg, of the same Warburg family who was instrumental in the 1963 founding of the Institute for Policy Studies and worked with both Huxley and Robert Hitchens. All in all, there were 149 MKultra sub-projects, many of them involved with research into behavior modification, hypnosis, drug effects, psychotherapy, truth serums, pathogens, and toxins in human tissues. For intelligence purposes, what was required of MKultra was the ability to manipulate memory. Thus, what the Freudians call the superego, Peter Levenda explains in Sinister Forces, had to be bypassed, allowing the controller direct access to the contents of an enemy agent's mind. That was step one. Step 2 would involve erasing specific pieces of information from the subject's memory and replacing those pieces with new bits of memory, thus permitting the agency to send that agent back into the field without any knowledge that he or she had been interrogated and had given up sensitive information. Step 3 was a potential bonus. Could that enemy agent then be programmed to commit acts on behalf of the agency without knowing who gave the command or why? This was the essence of the Manchurian Candidate. It is also the essence of what we know today as the hypnotherapy and depth psychoanalysis for psychiatrists. For the psychiatrist is looking for access to the patient's unconscious layers to extract important information such as childhood trauma and to neutralize the effect of that trauma, in some cases replacing certain behavior patterns with new approved patterns. The proximate origins for these actions go back to an overtly satanic turn in the 19th century Romantic movement. Notably, the exemplary connection of Britain's H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, and Theosophist leader Aleister Crowley to the role of Aldoushuxley in the promotion of what were originally known as psychotherapeutic, psychosis imitating, or psychedelic drugs. This connection exposes the satanic quality of the work of Aldoushuxley in the preparation of what emerged as the quote-unquote rock, drug, sex counterculture of the 1960s. Crowley and Capri resident Axel Muthane were the leading figures of the Satan Antichrist cult of Theosophy during the beginning of the 20th century. The publication of the pro-satanic periodical Lucifer in Vienna, with participation of Crowley, is exemplary. The role of Maxim Gorky in the Grotto of Capri was part of the pre-World War I activity of these pro-satanic circles. The composer Richard Wagner and the existentialist Friedrich Nietzsche were key figures of this Antichrist movement. From Wenthe et al., the original Antichrist was the Emperor Tiberius, whose son-in-law Pontius Pilate executed Jesus Christ. This was the circle into which Aldous and Julian Huxley were introduced by H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell during the late 1920s and early 1930s. Quote, notably, the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation of the 1940s and 1950s served as one of the principal covens where the architects of the 1960s rock, drug, sex counterculture often met, unquote. Firstly, ISIS is a drug cult. It is a cult of high priests and secret rituals. These secret rituals have been kept inside the British royal family and their ruling class friends for centuries. The cult was practiced in Egypt during the Third Dynasty of the Old Kingdom circa 2780 BC. Isis worship is essentially pagan, primitive mother worship. The Isis priesthood is a closed circle, and its nobility practice social control, total subjugation of man's free will, exploitation and subjugation of people. The Isis cult was popularized, minus its secrets, by Isis high priest Bulwer Lytton's work, The Last Days of Pompeii. Bulwer Lytton's son, Edward, was Viceroy and Governor-General of India from 1876 to 1880, when exports of Bengal opium to China were greatly stepped up. Bulwer Lytton was the mentor of Lord Palmerston, who led the British Parliament during the Opium Wars that forced an unwilling China to not only continue, but also expand the sale of opium in that country. Russian occultist Madame Blavatsky further popularized the cult of Isis through her book Isis Unveiled. Lord Bertrand Russell, who joined with the Frankfurt School in this effort at mass social engineering for the purposes of destroying man's creative powers, as well as wrecking European and American cultures, spilled the beans in his 1951 book, The Impact of Science on Society. He wrote, quote, physiology and psychology afford fields for scientific technique which still await development. Two great men, Pavlov and Freud, have laid the foundation. I do not accept the view that they are in any essential conflict, but what structure will be built on their foundations is still in doubt. I think the subject which will be of most importance politically is mass psychology. Its importance has been enormously increased by the growth of modern methods of propaganda. Of these, the most influential is what is called education. Religion plays a part, though a diminishing one. The press, cinema, and radio all play an increasing part. It may be hoped that in time anybody will be able to persuade anybody of anything if he can catch the patient young and is provided by the state with money and equipment. Russell continued, quote, the subject will make great strides when it is taken up by scientists under a scientific dictatorship. These social psychologists of the future will have a number of classes of school children on whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results will soon be arrived at. First, that the influence of home is obstructive. Second, not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before the age of 10. Third, that verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. Fourth, that the opinion that snow is white must be held to show a morbid taste for eccentricity. But I anticipate. It is for future scientists to make these maxims precise and discover exactly how much it costs per head to make children believe that snow is black, and how much less it would cost to make them believe it is dark gray. Russell continued with a warning, quote, "Although this science will be diligently studied, it will be rigidly confined to the governing class. The populace will not be allowed to know how its convictions were generated. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for a generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen." The Russells, an English noble family, came into their own during the reign of Henry VIII. Earl Bertrand Russell was the grandson of Lord John Russell, 1798 to 1878, twice Prime Minister during the reign of Queen Victoria. It was Lord Russell who proposed the development of mass drugging of populations as a method of social control through decriminalization of marijuana and other dangerous psychotropic drugs, and the modification of the use of language to provide methods of mass social manipulation. Linguistics. The drug side of the Russell Project was picked up chiefly by Aldoushuxley. Aldoushuxley was a grandson of the famous biologist Thomas Henry Huxley, whose outspoken support of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution earned him the nickname Darwin's Bulldog. It was Thomas Huxley, a leading member of the Metaphysical Society, which was founded in 1869 in an attempt to forge a more effective intellectual elite out of the membership of the Oxford Essayists and Cambridge Apostles, who coined the term agnosticism. Huxley and his leading circles denied the ability of man to actually know anything, the so-called, quote-unquote, no-soul doctrine that was at the heart of Wells' book Open Conspiracy. Unlike his grandfather, Aldoushuxley was a novelist who liked to experiment with drugs to discover his inner creativity and spiritual connection. Drugs, more than evangelists, he believed, had the psychedelic power to tap into a spiritual well of visions. Even a fleeting experience of self-transcendence could shatter society's traditional way of thinking about religion in each person's pursuit of a deeper and more meaningful spiritual life. Huxley predicted that religion would be transformed from an activity mainly concerned about symbols to an activity mainly concerned with experience and intuition driven by mystical inspiration. It all went back to Thomas Huxley's basic teaching. The unifying theme was the denial of the nobility of man, as expressed in the provable power of the human mind to create and discover new ideas. Aldoushuxley was a lifelong collaborator with Arnold Joseph Toynbee, an economic historian whose 12-volume analysis of the rise and fall of civilizations examined history from a global perspective. Huxley met Toynbee at Oxford, where he was tutored by H.G. Wells, who was T.H. Huxley's protege. While Wells went on to become the head of British foreign intelligence during World War I, Toynbee sat on the Royal Institute of International Affairs, RIIA Council in Chatham House, interlocked with the CFR in the United States for 50 years. During World War I, he also headed the research division of the Intelligence Department for the British Foreign Office and was delegated to the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. From 1925 to 1955, he served as the Director of Studies for the RIIA, and then during World War II, he became Prime Minister Winston Churchill's briefing officer. In an excellent investigative report on the Aquarian conspiracy, Executive Intelligence Review staff explained that Toynbee's theory of history, expounded in his 20-volume History of Western Civilization, was that its determining culture has always been the rise and decline of grand imperial dynasties. At the very point that these dynasties, the thousand-year Reich of the Egyptian pharaohs, the Roman Empire, and the British Empire, succeed in imposing their rule over the entire face of the earth, they tend to decline. Toynbee argued that this decline could be abated if the ruling oligarchy, like that of the British Round Table, would devote itself to the recruitment and training of an ever-expanding priesthood dedicated to the principles of imperial rule. Whereas Toynbee appealed to the highbrow intellects of the British aristocracy, Wells' science fiction stories had squarely positioned him as a pop star of the time. According to Wells, world revolution was only attainable through an open conspiracy, blueprint for a world revolution, using counterculture as a battering ram on an unsuspecting public. Wells wrote, "It will appear first, I believe, as a conscious organization of intelligent and quite possibly in some cases wealthy men, as a movement having distinct social and political aims, confessedly ignoring most of the existing apparatus of political control or using it only as an incidental implement in the stages, a mere movement of a number of people in a certain direction who will presently discover with a sort of surprise the common object toward which they are all moving. In all sorts of ways, they will be influencing and controlling the apparatus of the ostensible government." From his experience as one of the initiates at the Children of the Sun, a Dionysian cult comprised of the children of Britain's roundtable elite, Aldoushuxley gained material to create his famous novel Bravenewworld, published in 1931. Bravenewworld is a virtual blueprint of a true-life future one-world socialist government, or as Fabian mentor H.G. Wells paraphrased the title for one of his own popular novels, The New World Order, The Open Conspiracy, Blueprints for a World Revolution, which openly examines how this New World Order could be attained ostensibly for world peace and human evolution. Remember, the goal of Wells, Russell, and Huxley and company is the destruction of the sovereign power of the nation-state, and with it, the elimination of a philosophical, cultural, and religious tradition dating back more than 2,500 years. So what is it that makes an open conspiracy open, as in placed there in plain sight for everyone to see? Larry Hecht explains, "What makes the open conspiracy open is not the laying out of some secret master plan, not the revealing of the membership roster of some inner sanctum of the rich and powerful, which the typical deluded populace supposes to be the secret power in the world. It is, rather, the understanding that ideas, philosophy, and culture control history. What constitutes a conspiracy for good or evil is a set of ideas which embody a concept of what it is to be human and a conception of man's role in universal history." It was H.G. Wells who first introduced Huxley to Satanist Aleister Crowley. Crowley was a poster child of the occult that developed in Britain from the 1960s under the influence of Edward Bulwer Lytton, the Colonel Master under Lord Palmerston during the Second Opium War. In 1886, Crowley, William Butler Yeats, poet and Nobel Prize winner, and several other Bulwer Lytton protégés formed the satanic Isis Urania Temple of Hermetic Students of the Golden Dawn. This Isis cult was organized around the 1877 manuscript Isis Unveiled by Madame Helena Blavatsky, in which the Russian occultist called for the British aristocracy to organize itself into an Isis priesthood. Crichton Zoakos explains that among the other initiates in the Children of the Sun were T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, Sir Oswald Mosley, and D.H. Lawrence, Huxley's homosexual lover. It was Huxley, furthermore, who would launch the legal battle in the 1950s to have Lawrence's pornographic novel, Lady Chatterley's Lover, allowed into the United States on the ground that it was a quote-unquote misunderstood work of art. In Brave New World, Huxley centers on the scientific methodology for keeping all populations outside the elite minority in a permanently autistic-like condition, actually in love with their servitude. Speaking at the California Medical School in San Francisco, Huxley announced, quote, "There will be in the next generation or so a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak. Producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it, because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution," unquote. To Wells' way of thinking, this wasn't a conspiracy, but rather a one-world brain functioning as a police of the mind. In a speech on the U.S. State Department's Voice of America in 1961, Huxley spoke of a world of pharmacologically manipulated slaves living in a concentration camp of mind, enhanced by propaganda and psychedelic drugs, leaning to their love of servitude and abandoning all will to resist. This, Huxley concluded, is the final revolution. Huxley's cohort in the 1950s experimentation with psychotropic drugs, Dr. Timothy Leary of Harvard University's Psychology Department, provided another glimpse into the perverted minds of the Russell Huxley Frankfurt School crowd. In Flashback, his autobiographical account of the Harvard University psychedelic drug project, Leary quoted Huxley, "These brain drugs mass-produced in the laboratories will bring about vast changes in society. This will happen with or without you or me. All we can do is spread the word. The obstacle to this evolution, Timothy, is the Bible," Leary then added. We had run up against the Judeo-Christian commitment to one God, one religion, one reality that has cursed Europe for centuries and America since our founding days. Drugs that open the mind to multiple realities inevitably lead to a polytheistic view of the universe. We sensed that the time for a new humanist religion based on intelligence, good-natured pluralism, and scientific paganism had arrived. In 1954, Huxley published a study of consciousness expansion through medicine, The Doors of Perception, the first manifesto of the psychedelic drug cult. The Doors rock band borrowed their name from this psychedelic manifesto. Huxley borrowed the title from William Blake's poem, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, all things would appear infinite." In 1958, Aldoushuxley assembled a number of essayists that he had written for Newsday. In 1958, Aldoushuxley assembled a number of essays that he had written for Newsday and published them collectively as Bravenewworld Revisited, in which he described the society where the first aim of its rulers at all costs was to keep subjects from making trouble. He described a likely future, quote, "They completely organized society, the abolition of free will by methodical conditioning, the servitude made acceptable by regular doses of chemically induced happiness." He also predicted democracies would change their nature. Quaint old forms, elections, parliaments, supreme courts will remain, but the underlying substance will be non-violent totalitarianism. Democracy and freedom will be the theme of every broadcast and editorial, but democracy and freedom in a strictly Pickwickian, i.e. not literal sense. Meanwhile, the ruling oligarchy and its highly trained elite of soldiers, policemen, thought manufacturers, and mind manipulators will quietly run the show as they see fit. How different is it from what we have today? This passage is creating the counterculture. The undeclared cultural war against America's youth began in earnest in 1967 when Tavistock began using open-air rock concerts to attract over 4 million young people to the so-called festivals. Unbeknownst, the young became the victims of planned wide-scale drug experimentation. Hallucinogenic drugs such as dimethyltryptamine, phencylamine, dextromethorphan, and methadioxylophamine, and the Beatles-promoted LSD and Blue Microdot LSD-25 were freely available and distributed at these concerts. Before long, over 50 million of these attendees between the ages of 10 to 25 years old returned home to become messengers and promoters of the new drug culture, or what came to be called the quote-unquote New Age. Hallucinogenic drugs are psychomimetic, meaning that they mimic certain aspects of psychosis. Through the use of hallucinogenic drugs, one can induce temporary symptoms of psychosis and schizophrenia. Most users of hallucinogenic drugs at the time experienced whole personality changes, causing total alterations of the senses. The intention of the LSD drug scene and the controlled environment it represented wasn't accidental, but completely intentional. The Tavistock Institute had extensively studied the relationship between brain and behavior caused by hallucinogenic drugs. Later on, the knowledge gleaned from the research was channeled into marketing MTV and radio stations through classic oldies songs from 15 to 25 years ago, which are targeted at the adult population. Several Tavistock studies showed that a song or piece of music associated with one's childhood, when heard later in life, could call forth memories and associations of that earlier period. Encoded memories of popular music in the listener were recalled when he or she heard the same piece of music. These memories triggered an emotional drug flashback that set off an infantile emotional state that brought the listener back to that time in which he or she experienced either an identical or one mirroring the drug reaction itself. The first commercial American rock festival, officially dubbed the First Annual Monterey International Pop Festival, was held in June 1967, 2 years before Woodstock, when over 200,000 young people gathered in and around Monterey County Fairgrounds in Northern California for a 3-day celebration. Monterey Pop in 1967 was the general rehearsal for the widespread distribution of a new type of drugs classified as psychedelics or hallucinogens, such as LSD, which were to become prominent and widespread at later outdoor festivals like Woodstock. Author Robert Santelli, in his book Aquarius Rising, writes, LSD was in abundance at Monterey. Tabs of Monterey Purple, LSD-type substance also called purple haze, were literally given to anyone wishing to experiment a little. The two characters responsible for its distribution at Monterey Pop were a mystery man from Cocoa Beach, Florida called Peter Goodrich, and the legendary CIA contract agent codenamed Coyote. One of the organizers of the Monterey Festival was John Phillips, a member of the Mamas and the Papas rock group and former press agent for the Beatles. Phillips was closely linked with Roman Polanski and his wife Sharon Tate, Mama Cass, lead singer of the Mamas and the Papas, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys, and many other Hollywood celebrities who in turn were linked with Charles Manson's family. Manson family members stabbed to death an 8 months pregnant actress Sharon Tate on August 9, 1969 at her home in Los Angeles. Mama Cass and John Phillips were connected to Manson through the Process Church of the Final Judgment, an offshoot of the Church of Scientology founded in England in the mid-60s by a couple of former Scientologists, Robert and Marianne de Grimson. Formed sometime in 1963 to 64, PCFJ was a mixture of reincarnation, existentialism, an attempt to merge the worships of Jehovah and Lucifer, and a bit of neo-Nazi flavor. It is significant that the Process's legal work was handled by an elite Wall Street law firm, Morrison McVeigh, whose main backer was the American Family Foundation, who used intelligence-connected mind control experts such as LSD researcher Dr. Louis Jolion West to orchestrate cult anti-cult hysteria. Dr. West was a major participant in the CIA's MKultra, which came out of the Tavistock Institute studies of Nazi social control techniques. People with only a passing knowledge of the Manson case usually don't realize that the Beach Boys recorded one of Manson's songs and released it as a B-side of their cover of the old Ursel Hickey 1958 hit Bluebirds Over the Mountain, a song about lost love. The title of the song was suggestive of the CIA mind control operation. Bluebird was a program for exploring the uses of hypnosis and other means to protect the recently created CIA and its personnel from enemy psychic penetration. Bluebird. Is there a reason Manson's song was on the flip side of the Bluebird cover? Had the CIA's Bluebird escaped? Was Manson a quote-unquote Bluebird, i.e. a mind control subject gone amok? As Peter Levenda explains in Sinister Forces, the land of memory was the target of the Bluebird Project. To enter that land in another person's mind, to go through the drawers, rearranging the furniture and leave unnoticed. The Korean War was fought to a stalemate, Vietnam was raging all around us, Africa was ablaze in godless communists holding up the upper hand. In America, the year 1968 was the pivotal year in the lives of most people of the generation. It was a time of multiple assassinations, civil unrest, the riots at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, probably staged. That's just me saying that, not part of the book, but probably staged, those riots. And the election of Richard Nixon as president. And this section is called The Age of Aquarius Woodstock Music Festival. The largest concert of all time, the open-air Woodstock Music and Art Fair, was what Time magazine labeled an Aquarian festival and history's biggest happening. In the process, Woodstock became part of the cultural lexicon. Publicists carefully chose the term Aquarian. According to astronomers, the ages progress in retrograde motion, going in the opposite direction as the sun, which moves from the age of Aquarius into the age of Pisces, into the age of Aries, and so forth. If you follow astrological beliefs, the age of Pisces, an artifact of the precession of the equinoxes, is the time span from about 200 BC until the current day. Approximately every 2,160 years, the precession of the equinoxes appears to rotate the spring equinox from one constellation to another. We appear to be ending the age of Pisces and beginning the age of Aquarius. Moving into the Aquarian age signifies that the age of Pisces, which is the age of Christ, has come to an end. At Woodstock, writes journalist Donald Fow, nearly 500,000 youth gathered to be drugged and brainwashed on a farm. The victims were isolated, immersed in filth, pumped with psychedelic drugs, and kept awake continuously for 3 straight days, and all with the full complicity of the FBI and government officials. Once again, it was the networks of British military intelligence and the CIA who were the initiators. A man credited with Woodstock's creation was Artie Cornfield, the director of Capitol Records, which is now owned by EMI. EMI, led by aristocrat Sir Joseph Lockwood, stands for Electrical Music Industries and, unknown to most, is one of Britain's largest producers of military electronics and a key member of Britain's military intelligence establishment as a military contractor to the British War Office. Furthermore, EMJ's silent partner is another major record label, RCA, which is also active in military and space electronics and satellite communications. It is a classic example of what President Dwight Eisenhower would have called the quote-unquote military-industrial complex, but is really the one world government solidifying everything into fewer and fewer hands. Donald Fow, in his book The Satanic Roots of Rock, describes the event. 2 days before the scheduled start of the concert, 50,000 kids had already arrived in Woodstock. Drugs immediately began to circulate. Fow in the same book continues, for the next three days, the nearly 500,000 young people that arrived were subjected to continual drugs and rock music. Because of the torrential rains, they were forced to wallow in knee-deep mud. There were no shelters and no way to get out. Cars were parked over 8 miles away. Rosanen writes that the key to the Woodstock experiment was keeping our performers performing around the clock to keep the kids transfixed. On August 17th, the New York Times reported, "Tonight, a festival announcer warned from the stage that badly manufactured acid, a term for LSD, was being circulated. He said, 'You aren't taking poison acid. The acid's not poison. It's just badly manufactured acid. You are not going to die, so if you think you've taken poison, you haven't. But if you're worried, just take half a tablet.' The advice to nearly 500,000 people, quote unquote, just take half a tablet, was given by none other than MKultra agent Wayne Gravy. It would be another decade before the counterculture became part of the American lexicon, but the first seeds of what was a giant secret project to turn the values of America inside out were sown. Drugs, sex, rock and roll, massive nationwide demonstrations, hippies, communes, dropout drug heads, and Nixon presidency. The Vietnam War were tearing the fiber of American society apart. The old world and the new collided head-on, unbeknownst to the flower children that it was all part of a secret social and occult agenda designed by some of the most brilliant and diabolical minds in the world. Hidden away in prestigious foundations, corporations, and think tanks, these political and financial puppeteers ruthlessly and cunningly used pop culture to foster alienation and dysfunction to achieve arrested development and family breakdown for personal gain. Through 1965 to 1969, the psychedelic movement gained much momentum and culminated with events like Woodstock. However, quick as it came, it was gone. LSD was outlawed, Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin died, Timothy Leary dropped off his soapbox, and the United States, after failing miserably in Vietnam, drifted into a depressing 1970s. Yet, once again, Tavistock was waiting, ready to exploit that apathy for their personal gain. The control of reality, of the perception of reality, and the creation of consensus reality is a powerful political tool and has been since ancient times, when the proverbial sorcerers could appear to create solar eclipses by simply knowing when one would occur and act accordingly. To control and manipulate the reality of the masses, one uses what is known as psychological warfare. and it is but one step from controlling a person's perception of reality to getting that person to act on it. The CIA and Tavistock were opening a Pandora's box of demonic forces, the black box of consciousness. The techniques included drugs, various forms of hypnosis, and even more extreme measures such as those developed by Dr. Irwin Cameron in Montreal, procedures known as psychic driving, which involves drastic sensory deprivation sessions in an effort to wipe the consciousness clean and record a new consciousness over the old, much the same way we would record over a used cassette tape. It is the story of modern-day Frankenstein, or a laboratory full of Frankensteins and the monsters they made, monsters that wander the streets of our cities today. Quoting Peter Levenda, the complexity of the human experience is such that we can only wonder what trigger mechanisms exist in environment on television, in newspapers and magazines, and even the internet, that suggest modes of behavior to these victims that are dangerous to themselves and to us. It would be only a matter of time before the mind control researchers began to scour the records of occultists, magicians, witches, voodoo priests, and Siberian shamans to isolate the techniques that were used since time immemorial to supplant a person's normal, comfortable, everyday consciousness and replace it with a powerful, all-knowing, and sometimes violent and always deceptive alter personality, and to use those alters to uncover the action of deep memory. For MKultra was, at its core, an assault on the land of memory, the creation of new, false memories and the eradication of old, dangerous ones. For intelligence purposes in the search for perfection, what was required of MKultra was the ability to manipulate memory. But in exploring the mind and developing techniques for unlocking its secrets, the agency unknowingly tread on areas that have been the domain of religion and mysticism for thousands of years. When the CIA incorporated drugs into the program and bizarre sensory deprivation techniques, we had all the elements of a serious occult experience. Cults as disparate as that of Elias in Greece, Tantra in India, Siberian shamanism, Native American shamanism, Taoism in China, Jewish Kabbalism, even the relatively modern phenomenon of European ceremonial magic, as represented in the 20th century by the Golden Dawn, the OTO, and individuals such as Aleister Crowley. As mythologists such as Carl Jung, Mircea Eliade, and others have demonstrated, there is a great deal of similarity in technology among these arcane practices, and that similarity exists for a reason. The arcane doctrine and methods of a discarded science are at the heart of this study, because they reveal the mechanisms by which society in general, and the individuals in particular, have been manipulated by forces beyond their comprehension.